So, Brotherhood Workshop, I'm sure you've heard of him, famous for doing his Lego Lord of the Rings brick films, one of the best brick filmers out here. Today we're going to talk about his video You Shall Not Pass, one he made in 2020, and just all the effects in this are really, really impressive. And I think one of the things that stands off the bat is the lighting of the torches and the stick, which he does with a very impressive technique I'll let Dragon talk about.
Yeah, so this is something that I've seen, and I think I watched one of his behind the scenes, but there are a couple different ways that he does it, and there are a couple different ways that you can do it. First of all, I believe on the crystal staff, he has a separate, like, wired brick light that is inside the piece, and so it projects light up through, as transparent objects work that way. And then he just simply hides the wire or he masks it out of frame. Next, we have stuff like the flames and different like lightings on stuff. I know the light on Sting appears to be after effected in, and the torches I believe are him shining a laser on the brick, and since it's a transparent brick, it diffuses the light throughout, making a one like central point of light that's much brighter, and then the edges that still glow, which is a cool thing. What you can also do is, I think I've done this before, where you shine a light on your frame, a much brighter light, and then you mask out everywhere except that spot, and it gives this illusion of this main thing being much brighter, but that is only because you masked the frame around it, so that is the one that is affected by the different light. What about you, Porter? What are your insights on this?
Yeah, I think obviously what you said is totally accurate. And then one of the cool things about this is obviously when you're watching this, you can tell, whoa, they're in a dark cave. But at the same time, you can make out all of the minifigures really well. And you're not going to get that with just those tiny LEDs. So he combines the LEDs and the torch and the staff with some of these brighter, weaker lights that he just shines onto the minifigures as they move, which it takes a lot of work. You got to either hold it in a hand as you take each picture, or you got to prop it up somehow. But it does a really good job of lighting the set, keeping the rest of the set dark, and then at the same time making it feel as though the set is lit by just these two torches. Because in real life, they could light everything up. And I think that's a really good technique that isn't looked at a lot, which is having lights on frame and then like making those lights actually work with little flashlights and other stuff off of frame. So any chance you get to get little colored flashlights or any little flashlight, you should definitely take those chances. I know the Dollar Tree has them sometimes. If you see them, definitely go buy them. They're totally worth it.
Exactly, especially considering the more practical lights are, the easier it is to get the effects of that light. Because obviously if you give a light source on something in After Effects, it's going to be a glowing source. But that won't properly cast the shadows on minifigures or terrain objects, whereas if you have a light in the actual frame, it's going to cast the shadows correctly and it'll look a lot more real.
Yeah, with After Effects, I mean, you could be looking at hours and hours of trying to figure out all these shadows, and even then it's not going to look perfect. And then, of course, I know a lot of you guys don't even have After Effects. I mean, it's an expensive software. It takes a lot of time. So if you can do it practically, I think that's really the way, as many practical effects as possible. I mean, the fire on the Balrog at the end is fake, but it's also enhanced by a real red light that he's shining at the time. And everything else, I mean, there's a lot of real stuff in here. So as much as possible, because to the human eye, the real stuff will always look better. And if you mix in real and fake, the human eye usually can't tell which is pretty impressive.
Exactly. And that's sort of the goal when it comes to your visual effects.
Yeah. Moving on to a extremely practical effect is just how the minifigures run. At the start of this film, obviously, there's a lot of short characters, and he's using not the mid legs, but the actual super short legs for those, as those do really show the difference between a normal minifigure and a shorter one, especially with the hobbits. But obviously, those short legs aren't posable; they can't move. Yet when all these characters are moving, they look like they're running, which is really impressive. And he does that by, instead of moving the legs, he rotates the figure side to side as he moves them forward, it works really well, I think, in a group like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also something to keep in mind is most of the movements are roughly synced. So when I watch through this stop motion in 0.25 speed, and I see one of the frames where they all go from like standing still to moving, while they aren't moving at like a completely mirrored thing, they all sort of take that first lurch forwards at the same time, gives a little bit of eye movement as they move off screen.
Yeah, that is really important. And another trick, if you are going to use this many minifigures, is find an order of who's going to move. So don't just every time you take a picture, like move each character randomly. Be like, okay, character A, I'm going to work on him first, and then B, and then C. Because that way at least you can be like, I'm going down the line each time. Because you can see as they go down the stairs, they're kind of in order already. So I'd say, hey, start with the first character, move their leg, and go to the character behind him. That way it's at least somewhat easier to keep track. Even if you need to have like a little piece of paper with tally marks. Whatever it takes to not have to redo it afterwards. Because that takes up the most time and is the most disappointing.
In stop motion, it's all about preparation. Because no matter how long your preparation takes, having to redo an ill-prepared scene takes even longer.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to figure out what you're going to do beforehand than try to figure out what you're doing while you're doing it and then having to redo it. I totally agree. Speaking of that, set design is something that has to come before filming. The set design in this, I mean, it's somewhat basic with just those rock pieces, but it looks phenomenal.
Yeah. And this is an aspect, or rather one of those instances of set design being augmented by CGI. So one of the big things that is important when you're implementing a CGI set is making sure that anything that your characters would interact with, especially in brick filming when we have the ability to do this, because our sets aren't constrained as much by reality, is making sure that anything that a minifigure or character or object interacts with is real. So for instance, one of the big scenes, specifically in the thumbnail of the video, we have the Balrog and Gandalf, right? I believe in this specific thing, the only thing here that is a physical, actual, like, brick-built set is the bridge. And even at that, that could be incorrect.
Oh, that's correct.
But the important thing is, that's the only thing that you can see Gandalf directly touching with. And it is a nightmare to try and line up a minifigure to be correctly standing on imaginary studs. So you put everything in a green screen, except the things that will be directly touching each other, and then you add everything in the background. Everything else can be done with a simple, or it wouldn't be simple, but a Blender render, or I have no idea on the CGI part. My abilities aren't as advanced as, let's say, Portal. So what would you think you have to do?
So what he does is he builds the bridge like you said. Everything else is on a green screen. And then he takes the rock segments and he'll build maybe like a rock segment that's 10 long, 5 up in real life. He'll take a picture of it at the angle he needs it. And then he'll move it around in a different area, take another picture, and then he just duplicates that for the background. And it works. I mean, it's very convincing. The trick is just making sure it's at the same angle as your camera in real life, which is where it gets a little bit tricky, but he's very good at it. And I think even if you're not able to CGI stuff like this, I think the simplicity of this set, because it's really just those rock pieces, shows that if you do it well, it doesn't have to be this crazy complicated thing. The most important part of the set design is what the characters interact with. Everything else can be more flat and basic because the eye isn't really paying attention to that.
Exactly.
Now I think we should talk about one of the most impressive things that Brotherhood Workshop always does, which is the camera movements, which are done in real time. It's very impressive for me because you have to actually move the camera frame by frame instead of in real life. When you're taking a video of a real person, you can just move. You have to actually do this frame by frame, which is very easy to mess up.
So I would say on this note, something that Portal talks about in another tutorial, the one on the talking, is calculation beforehand. So in this case, you need to understand how much you want your camera to move, and you need to understand what that means. How long should it look? So if your minifigures are moving a decent distance across the right side of the screen, you should figure out how long it's going to take them to walk, and then you can measure out and divide how much you need to move, and that is something important.
Yes, and I think it's also important to note, a lot of people when they start to try out camera movements, forget that once you start moving the camera, it becomes a character in your film as well. Which means you can't just move it at the same amount every time. You have to actually ease in and ease out your camera, which means the first couple times it moves should be very subtle, and then it can begin to get bigger and bigger, and then as it slows down, you need to actually have it move by less each time until it stops. And that kind of helps the flow feel a little bit stronger. Which is an important trick I learned, because you can look at the difference between easing and not easing for the camera. It's very noticeable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just easing in general is such a key part of animation that like, you should be looking at every aspect of easing, whether it be set design, actually, easing and set design would be kind of difficult, but anything that you're doing, like visual effects, you'll see it's not going to be just a constant acceleration of flame. It goes from a little bit of flame to a little bit more, and then it explodes outwards. I think that's what's known in just normal animation as it is easing, but I feel like it's called an impact frame when it's like that largest amount comes out. For all the actual animators in the comment, please don't murder me. I'm bad at drawing as it is. You can't expect me to be good at drawing animation.
Well, I mean, yeah, you're right there, I believe. And then, yeah, we already talked about it. You talked about it a bit, but also the characters moving while talking. Brotherhood does very well, and he uses that same trick of planning out beforehand. And I think, honestly, the biggest thing to learn from this is the more you plan beforehand, the better you will look. Because I guarantee you, Brotherhood Workshop didn't just put all this stuff down on the ground and just start filming and was like, okay, I'm just going to fix all the problems in post. No, he planned this out way beforehand in terms of set, in terms of how the character was going to move. I'm sure he recorded the audio before he ever started taking pictures. And all of those steps is just really important. Even if that seems like a lot for you, maybe pick one thing to do before you film next video. Like maybe I'm going to record the audio first. And then next video, do the audio and have a plan of how the minifigures are going to walk. And then just slowly add stuff. And you'll notice your films drastically increase for everything you plan beforehand. Another part that I really like to talk about is the aerial shots and the upward shots. I think the way he achieves them is actually tilting the set 90 degrees and keeping the camera stable. And it builds these amazing shots that add so much depth. And in stop motion, you rarely see anything like this. Usually the camera is right on the same level as the figures, but Brotherhood Workshop does a great job of getting these really unique videos where it's looking straight up or straight down or has these angles. And I'm showing some clips right here. He goes to great lengths to achieve these kinds of shots, and it can be really frustrating to work with, but as you can see in the final image, they look amazing.
Absolutely. And I think that brings up the point of outside the box. Like, we see a lot in actual movies where the set itself moves while the actors don't, or the camera doesn't. It's important to understand that, especially in stop motion, we have limitations, and we have things that aren't as limited as compared to normal, or rather traditional filmmaking. So for example, our figures, for the most part, if you do it correctly, aren't as heavily constrained by gravity because they can stick to the walls per se. There's all sorts, but there's also posing limitability. So you just got to understand, and this is something you'll learn as you use the medium more, how it differs from standard filmmaking and how you can adapt stuff from standard filmmaking, that type of stuff.
All these tricks, like you could never flip a set in real life. With stop motion, Dragon's right, there's a lot of room for creativity of being like, okay, I want to do this, but I don't have the tools to do it. What is another way I can do it? Like, hey, I don't have a tripod that can hold my camera looking straight to the ground, but I can flip my set 90 degrees. So why don't I flip the set and work to make that work? It might take a couple test tries, and testing is important in stop motion, but being creative with that, if you get good at it, you can really start to fool the eye. And I think that's one of the great challenges with stop motions and brick films, is that what is a different way to do this traditional thing so I can actually do it? And Brotherhood is great at doing that consistently. Let's go to two minute facts that really add a lot, because the small details do really, really help to push your brick film to the top there. The first thing is there's a lot of characters, especially at the start of this video. And if you look slowly, no one is ever standing still. They're either moving while they're talking, or they're like slightly moving to look at different things, or moving up and down a little bit as they breathe. And just that little extra bit makes everything feel alive, instead of making it feel like the person talking is next to a bunch of statues, which is important in brick films, because in real life, obviously, people are moving. We can't just stand straight still. But in brick films, it's really easy to just not touch a figure if you're not using him. And I think it's important to remember, while he doesn't need to be moving in every frame necessarily, if there is an excuse to make him move, take that opportunity. It is so worth it. All right, one final point is a lot of brick filmers nowadays really love popping the arms out of the figures to make them do these crazy things. And it is a really cool technique, and I do feel sometimes it gets overused, because one of the things with brick films is the figures can't just move all these weird ways. And obviously, when you pop out the arms, you allow them to move in the weird ways, which is great. And I think sometimes it gets just a bit overused and the clay takes over. But you can see with Brotherhood, he doesn't use it until he absolutely has to. Like, for example, Gandalf, the only time I believe the arms pop out of the figure is when Gandalf is finally talking and it's a close-up scene. And he does pop them out, but just the tiniest bit to get the movement he needs. And then he puts them right back in. And, well, obviously, you can use them way more than he does. I think it's a good example just in general. Too much of a good thing can become bad. And if you don't need to use this weird technique, like, don't use it. And I think he does a good job of sticking within the boundaries of the minifigure for the most part. And I think it adds a lot to the brick film part of the film.
Exactly.
And that is Portal Master Studios' break film of You Shall Not Pass, the Lord of the Rings parody by Brotherhood Workshop. Subscribe if you enjoy this kind of stuff. More tutorials and breakdowns coming out soon.